108 men. That is all they had. 108 Australians standing in 6 inches of mud in Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, on the morning of August 18, 1966. The rain had not stopped for 11 days. Their boots had rotted from the inside. Their radio batteries were failing, and somewhere in the rubber plantation ahead of them, in the dark cathedral rows of heavia trees that blocked every sight line and swallowed every sound, an estimated 2,500 North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong main force troops were waiting. 2,500. He was wrong to worry. That is what the NVA commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Minh Chau, reportedly believed when his scouts brought back the patrol count. He had seen Australian units before. He called them the Americans' dogs. Well-fed, well-equipped, hopelessly conventional. He drew up an encirclement plan. He scheduled the annihilation for 3:40 p.m. He was wrong, dead wrong, because before the sun set on Long Tan rubber plantation, his battalion would be shattered, his regiment would begin its withdrawal from the province, and 108 men would have achieved something that 200,000 American troops in country had not managed to replicate in 3 years of fighting. Wait, here is where it stops making sense. The Australians called in artillery support and had it answered, 3,500 shells delivered inside 90 minutes. By a New Zealand battery that had never fired in anger in Vietnam until that exact afternoon. The resupply helicopter that broke through the cloud ceiling carried ammunition in cardboard boxes, by hand, by volunteers, in aircraft that had no business flying in that weather. Before we continue, quick question. Drop a comment and tell me your city, your country, and what time it is right now where you are. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button so you don't miss what's coming next. All right, back to the story. This story was classified at the highest operational levels for nearly 2 years. The after-action report that reached General William Westmoreland's desk was stamped and filed and quietly shelved, because the implications of what happened at Long Tan on August 18, 1966, were uncomfortable for everyone involved. The enemy stopped calling them the Americans' dogs after that day. They called them something else entirely. Stay with me. Phuoc Tuy Province sits roughly 65 kilometers southeast of Saigon, and if you look at it from the air, it is beautiful in a way that will kill you. The Rung Sat swamps choke the coastline, oozing the smell of sulfur and rotting mangrove, a smell that veteran soldiers described as low tide mixed with something organic and wrong, like the jungle itself was digesting something it couldn't finish. Inland, the terrain shifts into rubber plantations, their symmetrical rows giving false comfort, the illusion of order imposed on chaos. Beyond the plantations, the long high hills rise into thick double canopy jungle where a man could be standing 12 meters from you and you would not see him until he chose to be seen. This was not ambush country. It was ambush architecture. The Americans understood this after a fashion. Their solution was firepower, massive, coordinated, deafening. Rolling artillery barrages preceded every advance. B-52, arc-light strikes cratered entire grid squares. Helicopter gunships worked the tree lines before infantry ever touched the ground. The logic was simple. If you cannot see the enemy, make the environment itself uninhabitable. It worked sometimes in flat terrain, in open ground. In the 6th Military Region of South Vietnam, it produced something the classified reports called area denial, a bureaucratic phrase for spending $1 billion to make the NVA briefly uncomfortable before they melted back into terrain the bombs couldn't follow them into. Phuoc Tuy was assigned to Australia's 1st Australian Task Force in April 1966. Not because anyone expected them to succeed where American units struggled, but because the province was considered secondary, not a major theater. A holding action. The NVA's D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion and elements of the 275th Each Main Force Regiment had operated in Phuoc Tuy for years. They knew every trail. They knew the plantation schedules. They knew the fire support gaps. They had 2,500 fighters, veteran officers, and complete operational confidence in terrain they considered their own. What they did not know, what no one outside Task Force Nva fully appreciated, was what 6 weeks of patient, grinding, intelligence-led patrolling had taught Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. But this was only the surface. Captain Terry Burstall was not supposed to be at Long Tan. He was a liaison officer, American-trained, well-read, professionally polished, attached to the task force specifically to observe Australian small unit tactics and report back to his command on their operational value. Burstall, 31 years old at the time, had done his tour in the Mekong Delta with the 9th Infantry Division. He had seen firefights, he had written reports, he had attended the right schools. He arrived at Nva Base in early August 1966 with the professional skepticism of a man who had learned correctly that most things described as innovative in Vietnam were not. His first impression of the Australians was not favorable, at least not in the way he expected. They were quieter than American units, disturbingly quiet. Where American patrols moved with the confidence of men backed by immediate, overwhelming firepower, the Australians moved as if they were guests in someone else's house. They took longer routes. They stopped constantly. They sent 3-man scouts 200 meters ahead and then waited, sometimes for 20 minutes without speaking, reading the jungle the way you read a page, slowly, completely, before turning it. Burstall wrote in his field notes, recovered and published decades later. These men appear to move without urgency. Tactical caution is admirable, but I question whether the pace compromises their responsiveness in contact situations. He was about to find out. On the afternoon of August 17th, the day before Long Tan, Burstall sat in the task force briefing tent and listened to Major Harry Smith outline the patrol plan for Delta Company. A 3-platoon sweep of the rubber plantation, investigating NVA mortar positions that had hit the base the previous day. Standard reconnaissance in force. Expected duration, 1 afternoon. Expected contact, unlikely, light. Burstall noted the confidence of the planning. He noted the specific fire support registration points Major Smith had already coordinated with the 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery. He noted the pre-planned call sign frequencies. What he thought was, this is admirably organized for a patrol that probably won't find anything. What the jungle thought was something else entirely. What Burstall noticed first was what he couldn't hear. American patrols in 1966 generated noise, not careless noise, professional noise. Radio chatter on movement, confirmation calls every 15 minutes, equipment that clinked and settled, soldiers who communicated in whispers that carry differently than silence but carry nonetheless. It was the noise of men who knew that if they made contact, the response would be immediate and overwhelming. Gunships in 7 minutes, artillery in 4, medevac in 12. Noise was acceptable because noise was backed by firepower that neutralized the cost of being located. Delta Company moved differently. For 6 weeks before Long Tan, the Australians had operated on what their NCOs called the step-and-wait rhythm, a patrol movement technique inherited from the British jungle warfare schools in Malaya that American doctrine had never formally adopted. Every 4th step, halt. Listen for 4 seconds. Resume. It sounds absurdly slow until you understand what it produces. A patrol that covers 340 meters per hour, compared to the American standard of 800, but arrives at every checkpoint without having announced itself for the last 2 kilometers. The specific cost of not doing this was documented in a classified U.S. Army study, declassified in 1983 under Freedom of Information, that analyzed 147 ambush incidents in 3rd Corps from 1965 to 1967. In 89% of cases where American patrols were successfully ambushed, the enemy had detected their approach at a minimum of 400 meters distant. In 87% of those cases, the detection was auditory, not visual. The jungle heard you coming long before it could see you. The Australians had read this. Or rather, they had lived it. In 3 years of Borneo confrontation, where the distances were tighter and the margins were narrower and the tolerance for detection was 0. On the morning of August 18th, Burstall accompanied the 1st platoon as far as the plantation edge. He stood in the rubber tree line, listening to Delta Company move inward. Within 90 seconds, they were invisible. Within 2 minutes, he could not hear them at all. He wrote, "They simply ceased to exist as an auditory presence. I have not previously observed this in American units." But the silence was only the first layer. What Burstall couldn't understand from a briefing tent, was how much Delta Company knew about the ground they were walking into. Not in the satellite imagery sense, not in the aerial reconnaissance sense, in the boot sense. In the 6 weeks prior to Long Tan, 6 RAR had conducted 34 separate reconnaissance patrols through Phuoc Tuy Province, logging over 1,200 man-patrol hours of movement through the plantation terrain. They had mapped water drainage patterns, which told them where men hid during rain. They had logged soil compaction on 23 specific track junctions, which told them where heavy equipment had recently moved. They had cataloged broken vegetation at 17 precise grid references, the kind of cataloging that intelligence officers call pattern of life analysis, but the Australians just called knowing the ground. The smell of the plantation had become information. The rubber trees bled a white latex that smelled faintly chemical, antiseptic, industrial, wrong for jungle. But underneath it, during wet season, when the mud was churned and the drainage channels overflowed, came something else, the specific smell of disturbed earth. Laterite soil turned over, the faint ammonia trace of a recently used field latrine. These were not metaphors. They were navigational data. When Delta Company's lead scout, Private Paul Large, 19 years old, moved into the plantation at 3:08 p.m. on August 18th, he was walking a route that had been mentally mapped, updated, and confirmed through 34 prior insertions. He knew which drainage ditch ran east. He knew which rubber row had the soft shoulder that would slow movement. He knew, from memory and from briefings, and from the collective intelligence of 6 weeks of silent watching, where the ground would channel an enemy force if they tried to encircle. He walked into what he later described as a wall of people. The forward screen of the 275th Regiment's D445 Battalion, estimated at 250 fighters in the immediate contact element, with a further 2,000 in support depth. The contact was made at 3:15 p.m. Delta Company had 108 men. The NVA had at least 2,500. What happened next should not have happened the way it did, but the ground that the Australians had spent 6 weeks learning, the drainage, the channels, the compaction, told Major Harry Smith exactly where the enemy would try to move. And it meant his 3 platoons, even when one was immediately cut off and pinned, were never positioned where the enemy expected to find them. The NVA had numbers. The Australians had the ground. What Burstall witnessed next would disturb him further. Artillery in Vietnam was a blunt instrument, operated at scale. American doctrine called for preparatory fires, wide area bombardment before infantry moved, and on-call support that could be requested through a fire support officer and delivered within 6 to 8 minutes. This was considered excellent response time. It was adequate for the terrain and the doctrine it served. What Major Harry Smith had done in the weeks before Long Tan was something different. He had pre-registered, precisely, personally, obsessively, 39 specific artillery target points throughout the plantation grid. Grid coordinates, not areas. Points. Each one covering a terrain feature, a drainage crossing, a track junction, a rubber row intersection where lateral movement would concentrate. The 161 battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, positioned at Nui Dat, had these targets loaded, charted, and confirmed. When the contact exploded at 3:15 p.m., Smith did not call for general support. He called specific target numbers, pre-registered, pre-calculated, pre-owned. The response time from first radio call to first round impact was 90 seconds. Not 6 minutes, 90 seconds. In the next 100 minutes, the New Zealanders, 6 105mm howitzers, firing at a rate that pushed the guns beyond their rated sustained fire limits, delivered 3,500 rounds into that plantation grid. The guns became too hot to touch barehanded. Crew members wrapped their hands in sandbags. They fired anyway. The sound was biblical. Burstall described it from the base perimeter. A continuous thunder that had no gaps, not separate explosions. A sustained geological event. The pressure wave was felt on the skin from 1,200 meters distant. The rubber trees at the target grid were stripped to pale skeletal trunks. The laterite soil was turned to powder, but here is what made it not just overwhelming, but surgical. Because Smith's 39 pre-registered points mapped the specific drainage and channel geography that he had spent 6 weeks learning, the fires were landing on the routes the NVA was using to reinforce and encircle, not on open terrain, not on guessed positions, on the actual confirmed boot knowledge locations of enemy movement. The NVA's supporting companies, attempting to close the encirclement, were walking into pre-registered kill zones they didn't know existed. Burstall later wrote, in the after-action report that reached Westmoreland's desk and was filed without formal response, "The fire support integration I observed represented a level of pre-coordination I had not previously considered possible at company level. It was not reactive. It was anticipatory. The enemy was being engaged on terrain they had not yet occupied." He paused in that report. Then he added, "This was not luck. It was not. But the fire was only the third layer. Here is the thing about Delta Company that no after-action report fully captured, because after-action reports are written for commanders, not for history. These were not special forces. They were not elite pathfinders. 11 Platoon was commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, 24 years old, who had been in country for 7 weeks. 12 Platoon was commanded by 2nd Lieutenant David Sabin, also 24. 10 Platoon, which made first contact and was immediately encircled, was under 2nd Lieutenant Jeff Kendall. 3 lieutenants in their mid-20s, 1 major, 108 men, average age 21. And they did not break. This is the part that the classified assessments struggled to process, because doctrine doesn't have a good framework for it. 10 Platoon, cut off and pinned within the first 6 minutes of contact, did not attempt to withdraw and did not call for extraction. They tightened their perimeter to a circle 30 meters in diameter. 30 meters, surrounded by hundreds of NVA fighters. And they held that circle. And they called adjustments into the artillery, and they kept their spacing, and they waited. Private Noel Grimes, 10 Platoon, later described what the ground felt like inside that perimeter. The rain was coming down and the shell fragments were coming in from both sides, ours and theirs, and the ground was warm. The impacts had heated the soil. You could feel it through your uniform. Warm soil under artificial rain, with the universe trying to kill you from every direction. Inside that 30-meter circle, for 90 minutes, 10 Platoon killed and held and adjusted and waited. The key decision, the decision that historians have debated for 58 years, came at 4:40 p.m. when Major Smith had to choose. Pull 10 Platoon back, or hold them and use them as a fixed point around which he could now anchor the entire artillery pattern. He held them. He used them as an anchor. And because he held them, and because they held, the 3 Platoon position at Long Tan became a coherent defensive arc rather than a disintegrating retreat. The NVA reinforcements, pressing in from the north and east, ran into pre-registered fires on 3 sides. The routes they should have used, had used in every prior engagement in this province, were now kill zones. At 7:09 p.m., as darkness fell and the ammunition carriers landed under fire and resupplied through sheer human logistics, the NVA began to withdraw. Not because they were beaten in numbers. They still had 2,000 fighters within 400 meters of the Australian position. They withdrew because something had changed in the geometry of the fight, in the ground, in the fire, in the men, that their doctrine had no answer to. 18 Australians died at Long Tan. The NVA left 245 confirmed dead on the plantation floor, with blood trails and equipment indicating a further 350 to 500 casualties. The ratio, in 100 minutes of contact, was approximately 1 Australian per 25 NVA killed. But the final layer is not a number. At 6:47 p.m., with the light failing and the artillery still hammering and 10 Platoon still holding its 30-meter circle, a 20-year-old private named Kevin Dalloway made a decision that was not in any manual and was not ordered by any officer. His section had run dry. Not low. Dry. He had 3 magazines and no means of resupply until the helicopters came through. The man next to him, Private R. Eglinton, had been hit in the shoulder and was firing one-handed. Dalloway crawled, not ran, crawled, 11 meters through open ground under direct enemy fire to reach a dead NVA soldier's ammunition cache. He retrieved 2 AK-47 magazines and 2 Type 56 grenades. He returned. He handed 1 magazine to Eglinton and kept 1 for himself. He continued to fire. He did not report this action. It appeared in the after-action debrief only because Eglinton mentioned it to a medical officer. There is no medal associated with it. It is a footnote in Appendix C of the classified 6 RAR battle report, declassified in 1994. But this is what the Battle of Long Tan actually was, not the grand tactical architecture, not the pre-registered fires, not the doctrine. It was 108 men who decided, one by one, in small decisions that history does not usually record, that they would not move from the ground they were standing on. The jungle delivered its lesson, and the lesson was this. What survived from the NVA command records of August 18th to 19th, 1966, was sparse. But what existed was extraordinary. Radio intercept log, 275th Regiment, translated and declassified, 1971. Entry, 15:22 hours, August 18th. Forward screen reports contact with small Australian patrol element, Plantation Grid 472. Estimate 1 platoon, possibly reinforced. Orders: encircle and destroy. This will not take long. Entry: 1551 hours. Contact element reports severe fire support. Artillery, not aircraft. Accuracy is unusually precise. Request permission to shift axis to avoid fire zones at grid 31 and 44. Entry: 1619 hours. Grid 31 and 44 are also under accurate fire. Suggest enemy has pre-registered this terrain. This should not be possible at company level. Requesting clarification on Australian fire support doctrine. Entry: 1645 hours. 3 attempts to close the north flank have failed. Artillery continues to impact on approach routes. Entry: 1730 hours, casualties mounting in reinforcement companies. The small perimeter in grid 472 has not moved. They are not trying to withdraw. This is unusual. We are adjusting. Entry: 1844 hours. We have 2,300 fighters within 400 meters of the enemy position. We cannot close the final 400 meters. The fires are impossibly accurate. One company commander reports the ground itself is killing his men. That the shells are landing on paths that were unoccupied when the target was selected but occupied by the time the round arrives. He says the enemy is reading our movement. The intelligence assessment prepared by the 5th Nva Division and later recovered by Australian forces described the long-tan contact in clinical terms that nonetheless conveyed something close to organizational trauma. It noted that the Australian artillery integration exceeded the parameters of what should be achievable at unit level. It recommended that future operations avoid direct contact with Australian patrol elements without battalion-level preparation and specific counter-artillery assets. Then came the line that historians have quoted most often. These soldiers do not behave like units that expect to be relieved. They behave like units that have decided the ground belongs to them. The will had not broken. Not exactly. But the confidence had. And in counterinsurgency, in the grinding mathematics of guerrilla war, confidence is logistics. When the 275th Regiment's commander decided at 1900 hours to begin the withdrawal, he was not making a tactical decision. He was making a philosophical one. He had encountered something his doctrine had no category for. At 6:55 p.m., the ammunition had been expended, the rain had intensified to a curtain of white noise, and 10 platoons' perimeter had shrunk from 30 meters to something closer to 20. Major Harry Smith made the radio call. "Sunray, this is Delta 6. We are critical on ammunition. I have casualties. I am not withdrawing. Say again, I am not withdrawing. I need resupply, or I need the guns to keep talking. Over." The response from the task force came in 40 seconds. 2 UH-1 helicopters, Iroquois, unarmored, not gunships, were launched from Nva into a ceiling that the pilots described later as a gray wall at 200 feet. The crews were volunteers. The ammunition was loaded in cardboard boxes because the proper containers were unavailable. The lead aircraft, piloted by Captain Peter Badco, reached the plantation grid at 7:06 p.m. and descended through fire. He landed, for 31 seconds. In 31 seconds, his crew and 2 soldiers who ran to the aircraft transferred 11 boxes of 7.62 millimeter ammunition and 14 boxes of M26 grenades into the hands of men who had been rationing by single round. The helicopter lifted out with bullet holes in the fuselage and one crew member's sleeve shredded by fragmentation that had not, by some margin, reached skin. Burstall witnessed this from the perimeter. He had moved to the artillery position to watch the fire missions and was standing next to the New Zealand gun line when the radio traffic came through. He heard the altitude calls. He heard the landing confirmation. He heard the 31-second count. He said later, in an interview recorded for the Australian War Memorial Archive, "I have never seen a military decision made that quickly, executed that precisely, with that little margin and that complete and absence of hesitation. At 7:09 p.m., with ammunition restored, with the pre-registered fires still hammering the approach routes, with 10 platoons perimeter still intact, the NVA began to withdraw. The Australian Relief Force, APCs from a squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, reached the plantation at 7:25 p.m. When they entered the rubber tree line, they found Delta Company standing, not collapsed, not scattered. Standing, in their positions, over ground they had held for 100 minutes against an enemy force 23 times their size. Burstall walked into the plantation with the relief force. He saw the laterite soil turn to rust-colored paste by the rain and the impacts. He saw the pale, stripped trunks of the rubber trees. He saw 245 NVA dead, arranged by the geometry of pre-registered fires. not scattered randomly, but concentrated at the specific points where the drainage and the tracks had channeled the enemy advance directly into the waiting mathematics of Smith's artillery plan. He stood at the center of it for a long time. His final report, submitted to his command and stamped for restricted distribution, contained one operational conclusion that sat outside the formal assessment framework. It was one sentence, written at the bottom of the final page. It read, "If they fight like this, when there are 108 of them, we should consider very carefully what happens when there are more." The 5th NV, a division, never returned to Phuoc Tuy province in force. The D445 Battalion required 6 months to reconstitute. The 275 Regiment, after Long Tan, shifted its operational focus north and west, away from the Australian sector. Why? The tactical answer is the pre-registered fires, the ground knowledge, the men who did not move. These are real, they are documented, and they matter. But the tactical answer is incomplete. The deeper answer is that Delta Company understood something about the nature of the ground they were standing on that the NVA did not expect them to understand. 6 weeks of silent, patient, obsessive learning had produced not just intelligence, but a relationship, the kind of relationship between soldiers and terrain that changes the character of every decision that follows. They did not fight in the plantation as strangers to it. They fought in it as men who knew which direction the water ran and where the soil would hold weight and where it would swallow a boot, and slow in advance by the decisive seconds that fire missions need. Patience had purchased understanding, and understanding had purchased ground. There is a broader truth here that has nothing to do with Vietnam and everything to do with any contest between a force that arrives with overwhelming resources and a force that arrives with nothing but preparation. Resources create confidence. Preparation creates knowledge. And in the specific 100 minutes at Long Tan, in the warm soil and the curtain of rain and the 31 seconds of a helicopter landing under fire, knowledge defeated confidence. Every single time. The 108 men of Delta Company did not win because they were braver than their enemy. The NVA were brave, experienced, and formidable. They did not win because their weapons were superior. The NVA had numerical weapons parity and the immeasurable advantage of choosing the time and location of contact. They won because 6 weeks of silence had made the plantation theirs in a way that could not be transferred by orders or overcome by numbers. They had not conquered the ground, they had learned it. And the men who learn the ground they stand on, who take the time to understand it, to read it, to become part of its pattern before the shooting starts, those men do not lose ground easily. Because when you truly know where you stand, you become very difficult to move. The Battle of Long Tan, August 18, 1966. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. 108 men, 100 minutes, the day the jungle ran out of answers.